There was once a kid at my school named Blake. Blake faced a lot of bullying from nearly everyone, both behind his back and directly to his face. It wasn't like he didn't bring some of it on himself. He was prone to violence and often got in trouble for yelling at teachers. It seemed like he had been indoctrinated with some extreme ideas that went against what we were taught in school. I suppose it wasn't entirely his fault, as it likely had something to do with how he was raised. Still, that didn't stop anyone from treating him poorly. Blake was as unpleasant in conversation as he was in appearance. He nearly got expelled once for harassing a girl after she rejected him, complaining that he smelled awful. If only he had been expelled then, things might have turned out differently. The turning point came one day in history class. Blake interrupted the lesson to argue with the teacher about something related to the Civil War, and it quickly escalated. The teacher shut him down pretty harshly, humiliating him in front of everyone. This triggered Blake to start shouting about how the country had been ruined, but instead of listening, the class just laughed at him. He stormed out of the room. That was on a Friday. Over the weekend, Blake started posting disturbing content on his Snapchat. He shared pictures of himself holding pieces from his dad's gun collection, something he often bragged about. He even posed in front of a Nazi flag, which I assume belonged to his dad as well. But the most terrifying post was a photo of our history teacher's face taped to a cardboard box with the caption, "Getting ready for school on Monday." These posts sent chills down my spine. People had joked for years that Blake might do something drastic one day, but no one ever believed he would actually go through with it. Several students reported the posts to the school, but in hindsight, they should have reported it to the police. None of us, including me, took it seriously enough. If I had, there's no way I would have gone to school that Monday without knowing he was being dealt with. From what I later heard, Blake arrived late that day, during fifth period, right when we had American history. He wasn't allowed into class as usual, and was confronted by the school resource officer and a couple of administrators who asked to search his backpack. That's when he pulled out a gun and shot the officer before running off. I heard the gunshot from the opposite side of the school, and moments later the lockdown alert went out. We all knew it had to be Blake. I looked over at my teacher, whose face had gone pale. All I could picture in my mind were the bullet holes in the printout of his face from Blake's Snapchat post. After a few seconds, the teacher regained his composure, locked the door, turned out the lights, and ordered us to hide out of sight. We knew Blake was coming for him, and by extension, all of us. I remember thinking about how those lockdown drills we used to complain about suddenly didn't seem so pointless anymore. Blake reached the classroom door within minutes, pounding on it and yelling, "I know you're in there. I'm not an idiot." Students started crying quietly into their shirts to muffle the sound, while others pulled out their phones to either text their families or live stream what was happening, assuming they wouldn't make it out alive. Even I started thinking that way. My mind was racing with fear. I couldn't focus on how to defend myself or escape. It all felt too unreal. All I could think about was that I might die sitting on the cold tile floor of my high school, cowering in the darkness among a group of students that would soon become a pile of bodies. Suddenly, we heard a gunshot. The room erupted into screams and panic set in. In that chaotic moment, I made a split-second decision to run to the window and attempt to jump from the second story rather than wait for Blake to break in. Several students followed me, but I hesitated, fumbling around as someone pushed past me, sending me to the floor. That's when I looked back at the door. Blake was clutching his face, blood pouring between his fingers. The door handle was bent, as if he had been trying to break it. I just stared, trying to process what I was seeing. The teacher was yelling at us to get away from the windows and hide again. He called my name, trying to snap me out of my daze, and that's when I quietly muttered, "I think Blake shot himself." I said it so softly that I didn't expect anyone to hear me over the noise, but a few students did. and suddenly the room went quiet. A friend rushed to the door and peered out the window just as Blake was stumbling away. I finally stood up, and together we saw blood splattered on the floor outside. In the eerie silence, we could hear Blake's pained cries echoing down the hallway. Against every bit of common sense, I tried to open the door, but it was broken. It wasn't just locked, it was jammed. We were trapped inside, but at least Blake was gone. Hours later, we were finally freed and learned the full story. Blake had tried to shoot the lock off the door, but the bullet caused the handle to malfunction, sending metal fragments flying into his face. One piece lodged into his eye, ending his rampage. Blake was arrested and charged as an adult. He'll be in prison for at least the next 20 years. Fortunately, the resource officer he shot recovered without any lasting injuries. As for the rest of us, we were just lucky Blake's plan didn't go the way he had intended. It also proves one thing. Despite what movies show, you can't just shoot open a lock. My high school is located in an area with a lot of gang violence, so lockdowns were a relatively common occurrence. However, the one event that stands out in my mind wasn't related to any of that. The only time I truly felt scared wasn't due to a fugitive or a shooting. It was because of a student who everyone already knew was dangerous. His name was Jason. Jason was one of those kids who was insanely smart, but had serious issues with authority, focus, and socialization. I'm sure everyone knew at least one kid like that in school. He had been suspended once for bringing a knife to school, and then expelled later that same year for attempting to strangle a teacher with a shoelace. He came back the following year after spending several months at an intervention school, but unfortunately it seemed like he came back worse than when he left. I had the misfortune of being stuck in the front office with him once when we both got in trouble for different things at the same time. We ended up sitting there together, waiting for the assistant principal to talk to us individually. It must have been a hectic day because she was tied up with someone else. In just a few minutes, Jason started talking my ear off about the kids he met at the intervention school, pyromaniacs, drug dealers, and even gang members. They were clearly a bad influence on him, but honestly, I think he should have stayed there. It seemed like he fit in. He spoke highly of his experience and even said he made friends, which surprised me. At first, I was somewhat entertained by his stories about the trouble he got into with those kids, but then he casually mentioned something that sent alarm bells ringing in my head. Jason told me that someone at the intervention school had taught him how to make a bomb. Before I could ask if he was serious, the assistant principal called him into her office. That was the last time, and really the only time, that I ever spoke to him. It was strange because, despite everything I'd heard about him, he seemed to be in a great mood, almost happy, even though he was in trouble again. At the time, I thought maybe he would get better, but now I realized the only thing that made him happy was remembering the violent criminals he hung out with and thinking of ways to hurt people. By the third week of school, I'm sure Jason was itching to get back to the other school, which is the only explanation I have for what he did next. Otherwise, it seemed completely unprovoked, unless he really did enjoy causing harm. One day, during second period, Jason called in a bomb threat. He was caught quickly but refused to reveal the bomb's location, so the entire school was evacuated. I remember vividly how my stomach dropped when I saw Jason's clear backpack sitting against the hallway wall as we were walking out. It was stuffed with a garbage bag, and I immediately suspected it was the bomb. I told one of the administrators, who radioed it in. I felt incredibly lucky that it didn't go off while all those kids were packed together like sardines, walking out of the building. I was shaking as I made my way out to the football field, but at least I managed to find a seat in the bleachers instead of having to stand. We were out there for hours in the hot sun, locked down, waiting for the bomb squad to be called in to deal with the bag. The entire school had to be swept for other bombs. My fear gradually gave way to boredom. And eventually, I became restless. I started messing around with the people sitting next to me, joking that I was suffering from heat stroke and needed to lie down. No one believed me or moved, so I lay across their feet as a joke. It was all in good fun. They were kicking me and laughing. But while I was down there, I saw something that froze me in place. Taped to the bottom of the seat in front of me was a box wrapped in duct tape with a note that read, "This is the real one." I panicked, pushing the kids' legs apart to get a better look. At first, they thought I was being weird, but when they saw the expression on my face, they realized something was wrong. One of them had been sitting right on top of what appeared to be a bomb. I freaked out and jumped from the bleachers, twisting my ankle in the process. This caused a massive panic as word of the danger spread and everyone tried to flee at once. With nowhere safe to go and 1,000 students running wild, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Several freshmen were trampled, resulting in broken bones, and some kids even hopped fences and ran into the road or nearby shops. Many just took the opportunity to run all the way home. By the time the chaos settled, the school was nearly deserted. I'm sure Jason would have found it hilarious if he ever heard about it. What makes it even more embarrassing is the fact that none of the bombs were real. It was all fake. Jason was smart enough to have made real bombs and could have killed people, but he chose not to because his goal wasn't to end up in prison for years. He wanted to be sent to juvenile detention or another intervention school. All that fear, panic, and wasted time were just part of a sick joke he was playing. What haunts me is knowing that if he had decided to carry out his plan for real, a lot of people could have died, and I might have been one of them. No one was prepared for the threat he posed, and the school's response exposed a significant weakness. If those bombs had been real, the results would have been devastating. I don't know where Jason is now, but I hope he stays far away from me for the rest of my life. I live in Oklahoma, right in the middle of Tornado Alley. Extreme weather drills have been a frequent part of school life for decades, long before kids had to deal with all the other emergency drills. I went to middle school in the 90s, and I vividly remember huddling on the floor in the interior hallways of my school, lights off, with my butt sticking up in the air at least once a month for years. As a girl, I always felt uncomfortable, like I was exposing myself to all the teachers walking down the hall. But no matter what I said, I had to follow instructions. I came to dread the extreme weather lockdowns more than the idea of a deadly tornado itself. A tornado might strike once in a blue moon, but it felt like I had no choice but to moon the weirdest teachers every month. Even worse, the lockdowns happened more often than just once a month, because real extreme weather situations were very common during certain times of the year. One day in May, during my 7th grade year, such a situation occurred. At the time, my classroom was in one of the temporary buildings put up around the school to alleviate overcrowding. We all called them portables, but they weren't actually portable, just flimsy structures. The procedure for anyone in a portable during a weather emergency was to immediately evacuate and take shelter in the main building, leaving everything behind, including backpacks. We all sat on the ground, covering our heads with our hands, and remained in that uncomfortable, awkward position for much longer than usual. The teachers informed us that an extreme cyclonic thunderstorm, with a high probability of producing tornadoes, was heading straight for us. They told us we wouldn't be allowed to go back to class until it passed. All of that technical jargon was incomprehensible to me at the time, but they are words I've since learned to take seriously. Most of the time, those lockdowns felt ridiculous and overdone, but that day, as the howling winds grew louder and the haunting wail of the tornado sirens droned on, the light-hearted chatter stopped, and a real sense of dread settled over us. Initially, I felt a morbid curiosity mixed with excitement. I was a bit eager to experience a real storm without worrying about my home being destroyed. I didn't care if the school got wrecked as long as I didn't get hurt. but a part of me actually hoped a tornado would hit, making the embarrassment of the drills worth it. That hope didn't last long. Though the lights were off, natural light still came in from outside. But within minutes, the storm blocked out the sun, and it felt like an unnatural night had descended. The winds grew stronger, rattling the doors as though the storm itself was trying to get in. Then the hail came, smacking the doors like a barrage of meteors. What had been a quiet hallway was now filled with an overwhelming cacophony of noise. Fear gripped everyone. It was palpable. That's when we heard the telltale sound, the low rumble of rushing wind, like a freight train growing louder by the second. We all knew the tornado was close. It was undeniable by then, even though we couldn't see it. With every passing moment, it felt more likely that the tornado would hit us directly. A lot of kids started crying, and the teachers tried to calm us, but their own fear was evident in their voices. When the walls began to shake, the teachers finally took cover too. For a few minutes, we were all equalized in this vulnerable position, no longer worrying about anyone peeping, because we had bigger concerns. The air vibrated with the frequency of the tornado. I could feel it in my chest. Outside, I heard debris slamming against the doors, only to fly off again in an instant, like the world was being shredded by a wood chipper. The most terrifying moment came when the windows gave in, shattering as a torrent of air rushed into the hallway. The storm had finally found its way inside, and there was no escaping it. It felt like the entire school was about to be ripped off its foundation, with us thrown into the sky along with it. I clenched my teeth and prayed. I'm sure we all did. Miraculously, our prayers worked. Just when it felt like the tornado was going to crush us, the sound started to die down. Over the next few minutes, the signs of danger began to fade. Eventually, the sun returned and the air was still again. After waiting several more minutes to be sure, the lockdown was lifted and we were allowed to stand up. My legs and back were sore, but I was unharmed. The school was mostly intact, though there was some damage to the main building. However, when I stepped outside to where the portables had been, I saw the true devastation. The portables were completely gone, with only a few bits of rubble and some pipes sticking out of the ground. Everything I had in my bag, my scrapbook, notebooks, diary, was gone, swept away with no hope of being recovered. Realizing that if I had stayed in that classroom during the tornado, I would have been destroyed along with it, left a feeling in my chest I'll never forget. It's hard to describe what it's like to come so close to death at such a young age. Ever since that day, I've never taken the threat of severe weather lightly. It's a part of life here in Tornado Alley, but I was born and raised in Oklahoma, and it's where I'll stay.